The trail stretched endlessly before her, but Margaret Rose Sullivan couldn't see it. Her vision was blurred, the cold eating away at her body with every breath, and the blood beneath her was turning the snow a dark red. She lay on the frozen ground, broken, as the wind whispered across her skin like the final breath of a dying world. Her auburn hair was tangled with ice and blood, her green eyes staring up at the gray sky, the light dimming in them with each passing second. There was no one left to save her. Her chest burned with every shallow breath. The air was thin, her ribs cracked and aching from the beating she'd taken. The men who had done this were long gone, leaving her to die alone in the desolate Colorado wilderness. She had heard the sound of horses at first, but they hadn't come to help. They were long past, just memories now. Like everything else, 1,000 miles from the nearest town, no one would be looking for her. No one would care. A voice pierced the cold silence. "Good Lord, ma'am, can you hear me?" Quote. Margaret blinked, but the darkness was already pulling her back in. She wanted to let go, to slip away into the quiet of the snow, but something inside her, something stubborn, refused to surrender completely. She strained to focus, her vision flickering between a dream and reality. Was it the wind? Was it her mind playing tricks? The voice came again, louder now. Desperate. "Ma'am, please, don't give up." The ground beneath her shifted, but it wasn't the snow. Someone was moving her, and pain exploded through her ribs like fire. She gasped, her lips parting in a silent scream. The man's voice was close now, steadying her. He was here. He had found her. "I've got you. You're safe now." Margaret's heart, which had been stilled by the cold, gave one last, hesitant beat. She opened her eyes. The man above her was dark-haired, his face strong and weathered with age, though his eyes, gray, full of concern, held an unexpected tenderness. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering just over her body, unsure whether to touch her. She saw the shock on his face, the way his brow furrowed as he took in her battered form. She saw the anger, too, a flash of it, but he said nothing. His hands slid beneath her shoulders and under her knees, lifting her with care. Pain shot through her chest, but she couldn't even scream. Her mouth was too dry, her throat too swollen from the beating. She felt herself being lifted, cradled, and placed gently against something warm. A horse, its body sturdy and steady beneath her. He was careful, but his movements were rushed, urgent. He swung up behind her, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her close. "My ranch is about 5 miles from here," the man murmured, his voice low, almost protective. "I've got a housekeeper who can tend to your wounds. You're not going anywhere, not yet. Stay with me, all right?" Margaret's head lulled against his chest. She could hear the steady beat of his heart. For a moment, the pain and the cold faded, replaced by the sound of something more familiar, more alive. She tried to focus on his words, on the warmth of him, but everything else slipped away. Her mind closed like the shutters of a house caught in a storm. Her eyes closed, her grip loosened on the reins of consciousness. And then the hoofbeats beneath her seemed to carry her away, toward something she hadn't dared to hope for, toward a future that still felt possible, no matter how uncertain it seemed. Samuel Thornton had never expected to find someone like her on a snow-covered trail. He had seen pain, he had seen death, but nothing had struck him like the sight of this woman, frail and broken, discarded as if she didn't matter. He had buried his own demons, survived wars, and built a life from the ashes of loss, but nothing had prepared him for her. He could feel the way she clung to him, even in her unconscious state, the way her breath was shallow and weak. It made him angry, in a way he hadn't been in years. He had seen men do terrible things, things that left scars on the soul, but to hurt a woman, to leave her to die like this, it was beyond unforgivable. But she was alive, and that was something he wasn't ready to let go of. Not yet, not if he could help it. As they rode toward his ranch, Samuel's thoughts kept returning to her, Margaret Rose Sullivan, the woman who had fought to survive. The woman who would teach him, whether she knew it or not, how to open his heart again. Her breath was slow against his chest, her body too still for comfort. But for the first time in a long time, Samuel allowed himself to hope. And for Margaret Rose Sullivan, hope was the one thing she hadn't been able to hold on to, until now. Margaret woke to the smell of something warm, the scent of broth, and the faint crackling of a fire. The world around her was soft, like the space between sleep and reality. Her body ached from the brutal beating and her ribs screamed with every breath, but she felt warmth again, comfort, safety. The last thing she remembered was the horse beneath her, the man's arms around her. But that felt like a dream now. She wasn't sure if she'd imagined it, or if someone truly had found her in the snow, pulled her from the brink of death. Her eyelids fluttered open, and the light was dim, flickering, the kind of soft light that came from a hearth fire. She could hear the sound of a voice, faint but steady. A woman's voice, calling from somewhere out of sight. "He's been good to you, Margaret. He found you when no one else would. Don't go making this harder on him." Margaret blinked again, her vision blurry, but she could make out the silhouette of a woman standing by the door, her figure outlined by the faint glow of the fire. The woman moved toward her, her steps slow, deliberate. "Where am I?" Margaret's voice cracked, barely a whisper, as if her throat had forgotten what it meant to speak. "You're at Thornton Ranch, ma'am," the woman replied gently, taking a step closer. Her face softened, a flicker of sympathy passing over her. "Mr. Thornton brought you here after he found you on the trail. You were near gone when he found you, but you're alive now." Margaret swallowed, her throat burning as the words sank in. Thornton Ranch. Samuel Thornton, the man who had pulled her from the snow, saved her life. "Samuel," she breathed, the name slipping past her lips before she could stop it. The woman's eyes softened even more. "He's out working the ranch. He hasn't left you since he brought you in. But I'm afraid it's only a matter of time before he's forced to. He won't be able to keep protecting you forever." Margaret's heart caught in her chest, a mixture of fear and gratitude. The woman said he couldn't protect her forever. But it wasn't just that. She couldn't shake the feeling that the world would catch up to her. That she wouldn't be able to outrun the men who had beaten her, who had wanted to bury her secrets. The woman set a bowl of warm broth beside Margaret on the nightstand, her hands steady but her expression weary. "Drink this, it'll help. And if you can, you should sleep some more. You're still too weak. I'll tell Mr. Thornton you're awake when he comes in. He's been worried sick about you." Margaret nodded weakly. The weight of her body seemed to sink deeper into the bed. Like gravity itself was trying to pull her back into a dark place. She took the bowl in her hands, the warmth from it spreading through her chilled fingers, but her thoughts remained on the man who had brought her here. Samuel Thornton, the man who had saved her life, the man she didn't yet know but already felt tied to in ways she couldn't explain. Samuel Thornton wasn't a man who easily shared his burdens. He had learned long ago to carry them alone, to keep his thoughts to himself and his emotions locked tight behind walls he had built with his own two hands. But something about Margaret Rose Sullivan had changed that. She had shown him a side of himself that had long been buried, a side he hadn't even known still existed. The tenderness he'd shown her, the care he took with her every injury, every weakness, it all felt natural. Still, that didn't mean he knew what to do next. She had been through hell. She was broken in body and in spirit. And though he had given her sanctuary, Samuel couldn't ignore the truth. She wasn't safe. Not yet. He'd seen the bruises, the signs of a struggle, the evidence of a woman pushed to the very edge. It wasn't just physical abuse that had scarred her. It was something deeper, something that had taken root in her soul. She'd been betrayed. She'd been hunted. And there was a part of Samuel that feared the darkness still lingering in her eyes. As he sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, his mind wandered back to her. The way she had looked when he found her, broken and bleeding on the trail. How she had fought to hold on to life, even when it seemed like she had no reason to. He couldn't help but wonder, what had she been running from? Margaret drifted in and out of sleep, the steady rhythm of the ranch outside her window, a strange kind of lullaby. When she woke again, the sun was lower in the sky, casting an orange glow through the cabin's windows. She took in the quiet, the stillness of the ranch. It was a world that felt foreign to her, so far removed from the chaos she had known. Her body was still fragile, but the warmth of the blankets around her and the scent of wood smoke in the air made her feel strangely safe. The only thing missing was the one thing she hadn't dared to ask for: her life back. "Margaret!" The voice startled her, and she turned toward the door to see Samuel standing there, his figure framed by the light from the hallway. He hadn't changed much since she last saw him, though he did seem a bit more worn. There was a tiredness in his eyes, something he hadn't worn before, but there was also something else. Something that made her breath catch. He stepped into the room, his boots quiet against the wooden floor. "You awake?" Margaret nodded, unsure of what to say. She hadn't expected him to come in so soon. She wasn't sure she was ready to face him yet. "I brought you some more food," Samuel said, setting a plate down on the bedside table. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, studying her face, before he turned away. "I'll leave you to rest." But Margaret couldn't let him walk away. Not yet. Not when everything inside her was screaming to hold on to this moment. To the man who had given her hope when she had none. "Wait," she said, her voice softer than she meant it to be. "Why did you stop? Why did you help me?" He froze, his back still turned to her. Then he sighed, his shoulders lowering slightly. "I didn't have a choice," he said quietly, almost to himself. "When I found you, it wasn't about whether you deserved saving. It was about what I needed to do." Margaret felt something stir in her chest, a strange sort of warmth mixed with confusion. "And what's that?" He turned back to her, his gaze meeting hers with a steady intensity. "To stop living in the past and start living for someone else. For you, if you'll let me." The words hung between them like the still air of early morning. Margaret's heart thudded in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready to accept what he was offering. But in that moment, she knew it wasn't just about him saving her. It was about them, together, both needing something neither had known they were looking for. The days passed in a slow, quiet rhythm. Margaret spent most of her time in the spare room, under the watchful care of Samuel's housekeeper, Mrs. Finch. Each morning, she woke to a hot meal, a warm fire, and the quiet hum of life at Thornton Ranch. It wasn't the life she had expected to find, but it was a life she was beginning to recognize as her own, even if just for a moment. But the shadows of the past lingered. She couldn't shake the memories of the men who had left her for dead in the snow, their cruelty echoing in her mind. It wasn't just the physical pain that made it hard to breathe. It was the fear, the sense that danger was still out there, waiting. And that fear gnawed at her every time the door creaked open, every time Samuel's shadow passed by her door. She had promised herself she wouldn't bring her darkness into his world, but she couldn't escape it. Not entirely. One evening, after a long day of rest, Samuel found her sitting by the window, staring out at the snow-covered fields beyond. She hadn't realized how much time had passed, how much the world had changed since she had come to the ranch. The quiet of it all seemed so far removed from the noise of her life before. She couldn't decide if it was peaceful or suffocating. "You're still awake," Samuel said, his voice soft as he stepped into the room, his boots muffled by the thick carpet. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment before walking over to the chair beside the window. Margaret turned toward him, offering a small, tired smile. "Couldn't sleep," she said, her voice low and rough from the days of not speaking much. "I'm not used to this silence." Samuel nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. "You don't have to get used to it if you don't want to. I can't say I'm much for quiet myself." She chuckled softly, but the sound was brittle, like it was on the edge of breaking. "I'm just trying to figure out how to let go of all the noise. I feel like I'm still caught in it. All the things I thought I could change." Samuel leaned against the chair, watching her carefully. "Sometimes letting go is harder than holding on," he said, his voice steady, though there was something raw beneath it. "But it doesn't mean you have to do it alone." Margaret turned back to the window, watching the flurries of snow dance in the pale moonlight. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself trust in the safety he offered, in the peace of the ranch, in the warmth that had slowly crept into her heart since she'd arrived. But the truth was she couldn't leave the past behind, not yet. "You're still here," Samuel added, breaking her thoughts. "That's something, isn't it?" Quote. Her breath caught, and she turned to him, unsure of what to say. The depth of his gaze made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, something like hope. But it felt dangerous, too. "I'm not sure how to be someone who isn't broken," she whispered, almost to herself. Samuel's expression softened, and he took a step closer to her, but he didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled the space between them. "You're not broken, Margaret. You're just bruised. We all are." She swallowed, her throat tight. "I don't know if I can keep pretending everything's fine. I'm not that person." Quote. "You don't have to pretend. I've seen it. The way you fight to hold on. You don't have to be strong for me. Just be here. Just stay." The words hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she thought she might break. But then, there was a flicker inside her, something that told her to stop running from this, from him. "I don't know how," she admitted softly. "I don't know how to stop fighting for something I've lost." "You don't have to fight anymore," Samuel said, his voice steady, like a lifeline she wasn't sure she was ready to take. "You're here now, and you're safe. You can rest." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of his words sink in. "What if I can't rest? What if the past is always going to catch up to me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving her. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost gentle. "Then we'll face it together. You don't have to carry it on your own." The weight of his words lingered in the room, heavy and unspoken, like a promise she wasn't sure she could accept. But in that moment, with him standing there, offering her the one thing she hadn't known she needed, Margaret felt something inside her stir, a possibility she hadn't dared to hope for. Maybe, just maybe, she could let go. It was the following afternoon when everything changed. Samuel was out tending to the horses, and Margaret had just finished a quiet meal when Mrs. Finch knocked on her door, her expression serious. "Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Finch began, her voice lower than usual, "there's someone here to see you." Margaret felt her pulse spike. Who could it be? She hadn't expected anyone, certainly not today. Mrs. Finch stepped aside, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she saw the man standing in the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the unmistakable look of someone who had been following a trail for far too long. His eyes scanned the room briefly, then locked on Margaret. "Margaret Sullivan," he said, his voice cold, his gaze hard. "It's time to come with me." Her heart skipped a beat. The face was familiar, the man who had once been in the town where she had worked, the one who had spoken of bringing her in, the deputy. The nightmare was back. Margaret froze, her breath catching in her chest as the deputy stepped farther into the room. He was tall, with a dark coat that seemed to absorb the light from the fire, and his eyes locked onto hers with the kind of certainty that could cut through steel. The same man who had been chasing her, the one who had helped Hartley frame her for murder and theft. He wasn't here by coincidence. He was here to take her back to the storm she had tried so hard to escape. "Deputy Mercer," she whispered, the words barely leaving her throat. Her pulse quickened, a familiar cold creeping into her veins. Her body tensed, as though instinctively preparing for a fight she couldn't win. Samuel's boots thudded heavily on the wooden floor as he entered from the next room, his face unreadable. The tension in the air was thick, but it was the way Samuel moved that gave her some hope. His posture was steady, his expression calm, but the sharpness in his eyes betrayed the tension inside him. He wasn't going to let this man take her. Not without a fight. "Mr. Thornton," Deputy Mercer said, his voice flat and professional, as though he hadn't just threatened to tear Margaret from the safety of this place. "I'm here on official business. We're looking for a fugitive, a woman named Margaret Sullivan. You've seen her, haven't you?" Margaret's heart raced. She could hear the deliberate lie in his words, official business, when it was nothing more than a hunting party in search of her. She had been running from men like him for far too long, and now they had found her, here, at the place where she had begun to heal. Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't even look at her. He stared directly at the deputy, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know who you're looking for, deputy. You've got no business here. I'm sure you've been traveling a long way, but this ranch is private property. You're not welcome." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Samuel's stance was unwavering. his body a wall between the deputy and Margaret. It was the kind of protective stance that made her chest tighten. He was risking everything for her. Mercer's eyes narrowed, but he didn't back down. "You don't know her, do you, Mr. Thornton? This woman is a criminal. She's wanted for murder and theft in Denver. I've got orders to bring her in." Samuel didn't flinch, didn't budge an inch. "You've got no orders here. You've got no warrant. So you can turn around and leave." For a long moment they stood there, neither of them moving. The deputy's jaw tightened, but something in his gaze faltered. He had underestimated Samuel. And now, with every second that passed, he was beginning to realize it. "You're making a mistake," Mercer finally said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm just doing my job, Thornton." "You're harboring a fugitive." "Your job," Samuel said, his voice low and steady, "is not to come onto my land and make demands. Now, you'd better leave before I make you." Margaret held her breath, waiting for the next move. Her mind was racing, her thoughts tangled in fear and uncertainty. The deputy wouldn't back down easily, but Samuel wasn't the kind of man who gave in to threats. Mercer stepped back, finally conceding, but there was still something dangerous in the way he looked at them both. "I'll be back, Thornton, and when I come, you won't be able to stop what's coming." "Maybe not," Samuel said, his voice a quiet threat, "but you'll find that I don't care." With that, Deputy Mercer turned and left, his boots clicking across the wooden floor, each step echoing in the quiet of the cabin. As the door closed behind him, the tension in the room slowly started to dissipate. Margaret let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The fear still coiled in her stomach, but it wasn't as sharp now. She looked at Samuel, her heart heavy with gratitude and guilt all at once. He had stood between her and the deputy, between her and a past she couldn't escape. And now he had protected her from that darkness, just as he had done before. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling despite herself. Samuel didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, his gray-blue eyes softening, before he finally stepped closer, his voice low. "You don't have to thank me. You don't have to say anything. You're safe now. That's all that matters." Margaret felt the weight of his words, the certainty in them that settled her chest. But the truth was, she wasn't just safe. She was starting to feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She was starting to feel alive. "Samuel," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to repay you. You've done so much for me, but I can't just stay here. I can't keep hiding." He shook his head, his expression soft but firm. "You're not hiding, Margaret. You're healing. And when the time comes, when you're ready, we'll take the fight to them, together." There it was again, the promise in his voice, the offer of a future she hadn't dared to dream of. For the first time since she had found herself stranded in this nightmare, Margaret felt the weight of her past begin to shift. Maybe it wasn't over. Maybe she hadn't lost everything. "I won't make you stay here forever," Samuel said, his voice steady, his hand reaching out, brushing lightly against hers. "But when it's time, we'll get what's yours." Margaret nodded, feeling the sting of unshed tears in her eyes. She didn't know when that time would come, or how much longer she'd have to fight for the life she had once imagined. But for the first time, she felt like she had someone beside her, someone who saw her, really saw her. For the first time in years, she reached out, taking his hand. "Thank you," she said again, the words tasting like more than gratitude. They tasted like a promise. Samuel squeezed her hand, his touch warm and firm. "You're welcome, Margaret, but you don't need to thank me. You never have." They stood there for a moment, silently, the weight of what had just passed settling between them. It was an unspoken understanding. This was far from over, but they would face it together. The next few days passed in a blur, each one bringing them closer to the truth Margaret needed to uncover. But that night, as she sat in the warmth of the firelight, the door to the world outside still closed, she realized something. Samuel wasn't just her protector anymore. He had become the reason she kept fighting. And when the time came, she would fight for him, just as he had fought for her. They were no longer strangers. The days dragged on with a sense of quiet urgency. the ranch becoming both a sanctuary and a place of preparation. Samuel and Margaret kept to their routines, though beneath the surface something was shifting. The danger hadn't passed. In fact, it had only just begun. But as each day passed, something stronger than fear began to take root in Margaret. It was a sense of belonging, of peace, but more than that, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Still, every morning when the sun broke over the mountains, every night when the wind howled through the trees, the shadow of her past followed her. Hartley's men were still out there. The deputy, Mercer, wasn't the only one looking for her. But what had once been an overwhelming fear was now something else. It was a cold, simmering anger that burned brighter with each passing day. Margaret had spent enough years running from the truth. The evidence she had hidden, the ledgers, the letters, the proof of Hartley's embezzlement was still locked away in Denver, tucked inside a church where she had left it behind, hidden for safety. But each time she thought about it, each time she let her mind drift to what lay in that satchel, the reality of what it meant settled heavier on her shoulders. "I can't stay here forever," she said one evening, her voice quiet as she sat across from Samuel by the fire. "I have to go. I need to clear my name. I need to get the evidence." Samuel looked at her, his brow furrowed. He was sitting beside her now, his hand resting near hers, the firelight casting flickering shadows on their faces. He had known she would say it eventually, knew she wouldn't stay hidden, not forever. He wasn't sure he was ready for it, but he also knew there was no stopping her now. "I'm not asking you to stay here forever, Margaret," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I'm asking you to be careful. I'm asking you to let me help you, like I promised." She looked at him, her eyes searching his, looking for something she hadn't allowed herself to look for until now. Maybe it was trust. Maybe it was hope. "I don't know what I'll find when I go back," she said softly, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "I don't know if it's even worth it. I don't know if it'll clear my name or just make things worse. But I can't live with myself if I don't at least try." Samuel's hand found hers then, his fingers curling around hers with a gentle pressure. "You don't have to go alone," he said. "I'm not going to let you do this by yourself." Quote. Margaret hesitated, but only for a moment. The idea of taking Samuel with her felt like a lifeline, but it also felt like she was dragging him into the very danger she had spent so long trying to escape. She didn't want him to pay the price for her mistakes, for her fight. "You've already done so much for me," she whispered. "You've risked everything for me. I can't let you risk it all again." Samuel didn't respond at first. Instead, he just held her hand tighter, his gaze soft and steady. "Margaret, I haven't done anything I didn't choose to do, and I'm not going to stop choosing you." Her heart raced at the words, the raw honesty in his voice, the certainty. It was terrifying, but it was also exactly what she needed to hear. "I don't know what will happen," Margaret said, her voice low, her chest tight. "But I can't do this without you." "You don't have to," Samuel replied simply, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "You're not alone in this anymore." The next few days were filled with the quiet hum of preparation. Samuel worked the ranch, his focus never straying too far from his daily tasks, but his mind was elsewhere, thinking of the road ahead. He had packed provisions, enough for a week, and arranged for a safe route to Denver. It wasn't going to be easy. They would have to move fast, keep their heads down, and pray that no one caught wind of their plan. When the time came to leave, Margaret stood in the doorway of the small cabin, her hand resting on the frame. She looked out at the snow-covered land beyond, her mind a whirlwind of what-ifs. She was scared. She didn't know what awaited her in Denver or how much longer they could stay ahead of Hartley's men. But she had to do this. For herself. For the memory of Peter. For everyone who had suffered because of Marcus Hartley's greed. "I'm ready," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel stood beside her, his coat pulled tight against the cold. His eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "Then let's go." They didn't say much more after that. There was no need. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was understanding, the kind that came from knowing what needed to be done. Samuel mounted his horse, and Margaret followed suit, her heart pounding in her chest. Together, they rode out from the safety of Thornton Ranch, the wind biting at their faces as they made their way toward Denver, toward the evidence that could clear her name. It was a long ride, but it wasn't the journey that wore on Margaret. It was the weight of the truth she carried with her. She had always believed that the truth would set her free. But now, she wasn't so sure. The truth had cost her everything before. Would it do the same again? The ride was exhausting, but it wasn't the journey itself that weighed on her. It was the looming fear of what would come once they arrived. Denver wasn't a city she could just walk into without looking over her shoulder. Hartley had eyes everywhere, and Samuel's presence would make them targets. They had stopped for the night in a small town just outside Denver, the cold air biting at their skin as they huddled by a campfire. Samuel was tending to the horses while Margaret sat beside the fire, her mind 1,000 miles away. She thought about the man who had made her life a living hell. She thought about the people who had died because of his greed. The fear that had once paralyzed her was now a quiet hum in the background. She could still feel it, but she was learning to live with it. She wasn't running anymore. And that gave her a strength she hadn't known she had. "Tomorrow," Samuel said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "We'll be in Denver. We'll get your evidence." Margaret looked up at him, her heart swelling in her chest. He was right. Tomorrow was the day. They would face whatever came next, together. And she wasn't alone anymore. The morning they reached Denver, the air felt colder, sharper, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to unfold. The city was bustling with life, people moving quickly through the streets, their faces turned down against the chill. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a storm, and she wasn't sure if they would come out of it unscathed. Her mind kept racing about the evidence, the danger that still clung to her every step, and about Samuel. He had given up so much for her already. The more she thought about it, the more the guilt weighed on her. She wasn't the kind of woman who could sit by and let someone else fight her battles, even if that someone was Samuel. She had to prove herself, had to finish what she had started, no matter the cost. Samuel, ever perceptive, must have sensed her unease. As they walked through the crowded streets, his hand brushed against hers, his presence grounding her in ways she hadn't expected. She glanced up at him, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed to blur. In that moment, it wasn't about the danger, the men chasing her, or even the evidence that would bring down Hartley. It was about him, the man who had stood beside her through it all, who had become her anchor in a storm she thought she'd never survive. "We'll make it through this," Samuel murmured, his voice low but steady. "We're almost there." Margaret nodded, but her stomach twisted with uncertainty. They had a plan, a route to get to the cathedral, but nothing about it felt certain. Nothing had ever felt certain since she had stumbled onto this path. They arrived at the narrow alleyway leading to the back entrance of St. Mary's Cathedral, just as the sun began to dip behind the city's skyline. Samuel stood watch while Margaret, her heart pounding, slipped through the back door of the church, her footsteps echoing off the cold stone floor. The cathedral was eerily quiet, the silence almost suffocating, broken only by the soft rustle of her coat as she moved deeper into the building. Father Michael had been kind enough to offer his help. The old priest had provided them with a key to the bell tower, where the evidence Margaret had hidden months ago lay waiting. The plan was simple: retrieve the evidence, get out before anyone noticed them, and head straight for the federal marshal's office in San Francisco. But the plan had always been shaky, and as Margaret moved through the darkened hallways of the cathedral, she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. She reached the bell tower stairs, her fingers trembling as she inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the old wood groaning beneath her feet. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the place, the history, the secrets it had witnessed. The same secrets that had brought her here, to this moment, and the ones that had nearly destroyed her. The ledgers, the letters, all the evidence she had gathered. Her hands shook as she reached behind the loose stone, feeling for the leather-bound packet she had left there so long ago. When her fingers closed around it, a sense of relief flooded her, followed by a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. This was it. She had it. The proof that could finally clear her name. But as she stood there, clutching the evidence in her hands, a noise from below caught her attention. Footsteps, several of them, moving quickly, deliberately. Her heart skipped a beat. The sound was too close. They were already here. The door to the bell tower burst open, and Margaret's blood ran cold. Cole Brennan stood in the doorway, his familiar scarred face twisted into a cruel grin. Two of his men flanked him, their hands hovering near their weapons. "Well, well," Brennan said, his voice dripping with malice. "The bookkeeper and the cowboy. I should have known you'd come for this. But you've made a mistake. This is where it ends." Margaret's heart raced, panic rising in her chest. She could feel the weight of the evidence in her hands, but it meant nothing if she didn't get it out of here. She had been so close, too close to fail now. Samuel's voice came from below, calm but determined. "It doesn't have to end this way, Brennan. You've already lost. It's over." Brennan's smile faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. "You don't get to decide that. I do. And this time, you're both gonna pay." Margaret gripped the packet tighter, her mind racing for a way out. But there was no easy escape, no way around it. They were cornered. And as the tension in the room grew, it felt like the entire world had slowed down. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a gunshot. The shot rang out, its echo deafening in the silence of the bell tower. It wasn't aimed at her. It wasn't aimed at Samuel. It was aimed at one of Brennan's men, who dropped to the ground with a guttural cry. Samuel stood in the doorway, his gun raised, his face hard as stone. "I told you, Brennan," Samuel said, his voice low and controlled. "You don't get to decide how this ends. I do." The room fell into chaos. Brennan's remaining men pulled their guns, but Samuel was faster, his movements precise and calculated. The sound of gunfire filled the air, the tension breaking as bullets flew. Margaret ducked behind the wall, her heart pounding in her chest as the fight played out before her. She could hear Samuel's voice, steady and commanding, as he ordered Brennan's men to drop their weapons. In the end, it was over as quickly as it had started. The sound of silence rushed in, and Margaret breathed a sigh of relief. Samuel had taken them down, but the real victory was the evidence in her hands. Brennan, bloodied but alive, glared at Samuel. "This isn't over, Thornton. You're making a mistake you won't live to regret." Samuel stepped closer to him, his expression hard. "The only mistake I made was letting you get this far." Margaret emerged from her hiding spot, the ledgers still clutched tightly to her chest. She looked down at Brennan, her chest tightening. She had come so far to get here, and now, finally, she could see the light at the end of the tunnel. "We're not finished yet, Brennan," she said, her voice steady and fierce. "But we will be. I'll make sure of it." With that, they left the bell tower, the evidence in hand, and stepped into the unknown. They had a long road ahead of them. San Francisco, federal marshals, the truth. But for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt like she was walking towards something worth fighting for. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But they were going to win this, together. The journey to San Francisco was long and dangerous, but they never stopped moving forward. With every step, every mile, Margaret's confidence grew. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was standing tall, facing the future with the one person who had never turned his back on her. And when they finally reached the city, when they stood before the federal marshals, the truth was on their side. The evidence was irrefutable. Hartley was finished. And Margaret's name was cleared. But it wasn't just the victory that mattered. It was the life she had built with Samuel, one built on trust, love, and survival. And when she looked at him, standing beside her as they stepped into the future, she knew it wasn't just about the justice they had fought for. It was about the love they had found, and the promise of a life they could finally build together. If you felt this tale in your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Archives of the Wild West, where every story rides through the dust, the danger, and the kind of love that never dies. See you in the next tale, partner.